The internal combustion engine is not all that complicated, really. It's actually a pretty clever machine. It has a few hundred parts, and when they're all working together, it converts fuel and air into horsepower. It's that part about making horsepower that makes the internal combustion engine such a love object for so many people. The goal for the earliest engines was just to stay running for a respectable period of time. Also, not a lot was known about this substance called gasoline, other than it exploded when it was mixed with air and brought near a flame. But it wasn't long before some smart people started to figure out what was going on inside these cast iron monsters.
Engines are all about pumping air through them. In the gasoline engine, about 12.5 or 12.5 to 1 would be your full power mixture. 12.5 pounds of air to every 1 pound of fuel. So if I want to make more power, I got to have more air.
As early as the 1920s, some very racy guys were making big power using this recipe.
Harry Miller, with a 91 cubic inch straight 8 in 1928, made 270 horsepower with a supercharged alcohol burning engine.
Since then, engine design has raced forward. Engines today make more power and run flat out longer than anyone could have dreamed just several years ago.
159 cubic inch offie on alcohol. I saw one at the Champion Dyno in Long Beach. It came apart, but it was making 1,100 horsepower when we painted the walls with Offenhauser parts.
But no matter how small or large the engine, no matter how much power it cranks out, Job 1 today remains the same as Job 1 100 years ago. It's still all about burning a fuel and air mixture as efficiently as possible.
You need more than just air. Obviously, the reason you want to introduce more air to an engine is so that you can mix fuel with it, and it's the fuel that actually has the power inside it. You have to unlock the power from the fuel, whether it's gasoline or alcohol, whatever type of fuel you may be using.
If I want to put more fuel in the engine, I have to have more air. Pounds of air.
Well, obviously, there's a big science involved here. Fortunately, we've got a scientist to help us. And since this is a muscle car show, we've also called in a few muscle car experts. Get out your notebooks. We're going to find out how they make power when we come back on the American Muscle Car. So far, we've established that your high-horsepower muscle car power plant is just a big air pump. The more air it pumps, the more power it makes, or something like that. But if it was just that easy, our story would be over right about now. Of course, there's a little more to it than that. To find out what's really going on, we talked to Keith Maney from Year One Incorporated. Keith has his finger on the pulse of the muscle car hobby. We also visited the recognized authority in the field of forced air induction, Gale Banks. Gale Banks Engineering is one of the world's foremost think tanks for designing and building internal combustion engines. Nobody knows more about how to get air into and out of an engine than these guys. And go figure this, it all started on the streets of Southern California.
I grew up in Southern California and went to high school in the 50s. If you didn't have a car, you didn't have dates. I wrenched my way through college. So I went to college because I wanted to know how you made the things I was bolting on.
Gale Banks' credentials are no secret to anyone interested in high performance. From world land speed records to road racing pickup trucks, just about everything in between, his desire to blow the doors off the guy in the next lane has led him to create Gale Banks Engineering, a mecca for high-performance research and development that even Detroit's big three car makers call on when they need help. So naturally, when you talk with him about engines being air pumps, be prepared to get the full story.
An engine, every 2 revolutions, pumps its own volume. So if you have a 427 Chevy, every 2 revolutions, it pumps 427 cubic inches. How do we make more power? We make each cubic inch of air heavier, more oxygen. That means I can put more fuel in the engine.
Okay, let's review. To make more horsepower, you need to burn more fuel. To burn more fuel, you don't need just more air, you need dense air, which contains more oxygen. Dense air means heavier air. Cold air is heavier. Well, what do you know? Muscle car people have known that for years.
Normally, aspirated engines really respond well to cold, clean, ducted air from outside. It's a theory that most of the factories used when they came out with big, hairy hood scoops, during the muscle car era. Well, that and they look cool.
That's the whole idea of ram air. Cold air at the highest possible pressure. The colder the air is, the more power you'll make.
From Mopar's massive superstock scoops to Chevy's cowl induction setup to the Oldsmobile 442's trick under-the-bumper plumbing, all the coolest muscle cars had some method of getting cold air into the intake manifold. Some worked, and some were more show than go. But at full tilt, a 400 cubic inch engine with a big carburetor needs air to make horsepower. Otherwise, that big engine is going to choke to death.
Without that air, if you put in the fuel, it gets too rich and it just lays down.
But even with a so-called ram air system, some muscle cars will inevitably get to the point where they run out of power. Then what?
I'm at wide open throttle. I've done the ram air. I've got the low restriction air filter and cold air into the engine, and I've got all this power, but I want more. So how do I get more? How do I open the throttle more?
What comes after wide open throttle? Good question. We'll answer it when we come back on the American Muscle Car. Muscle cars do tend to spend a lot of time with a pedal to the metal, so it's important to know what's going on right then. And what exactly is this thing called a throttle anyway?
First of all, if you had no throttle and you started the engine, what would it do? If it had a carburetor with no throttle in it, the thing would fire up and run away because the full air density going into the engine is unrestricted. How do you get it so that you can put fuel in to make it idle, a little bit of fuel, and have the right air-fuel ratio at idle? You restrict the air with a throttle. So all a throttle does is regulate the air density in the intake manifold. That's all it does.
But when your foot's already on the floor and you want more, what are you going to do?
What's life after wide open throttle? Supercharging.
Superchargers are almost as old as the internal combustion engine itself, and they do such a good job of jamming air into the intake manifold, they've been a favorite of high-performance junkies for decades. But like just about everything when it comes to muscle cars, there's a light side and a dark side to supercharging.
There's two basic types of superchargers. The positive displacement, that would be like a GMC 671, or it would be like the Eaton that's used on the new GT500 Ford Mustang. Then you have the centrifugal. The centrifugal uses a compressor much like a turbocharger. They're belt-driven off of the engine, so they draw horsepower from the engine, which means you've got to make extra horsepower in the engine to drive the supercharger. When you put pressure into the intake manifold, if you don't heat the air, every pound of pressure or boost that you put into the intake manifold of an engine with a supercharger or turbo, every pound of pressure gives you 7% greater power.
When you do Mr. Banks' math, supercharging looks like the deal of the century. 1 pound of boost equals a 7% horsepower increase. So a nice, easy 10 pounds of boost would give you 70% more horsepower. Plus, you just can't beat the looks of a nice, shiny supercharger sitting on top of your fine muscle car mill. Not to mention that blower whine that tells everyone on the street that you're not messing around.
We chose to supercharge this car because it's, for a street application, it's a nice, clean, simple installation. Basically, you take the intake manifold off, you bolt on a special intake with a blower on top of it, and you run a belt to the crank. That's pretty much it. Now, you can get into some intercoolers and things like that, but on this particular car, it's a nice, clean, simple installation, not all that hard to do.
So if that's all there is to it, where do we sign up? But remember when we said there was a light side and a dark side to supercharging? Well, that's just one of the fun things that can happen if the rest of the engine isn't ready for all that boost from your new huffer.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. It's going to stress everything underneath it. Superchargers like on this particular car, we can basically put on a stock bottom end and not feel too bad about it. However, if we wanted to make a lot more boost, or if we were going to turbocharge the car heavily, something like that, then we really need to go through the bottom end, make all the things in the bottom of the engine are going to be able to withstand all that power that you're going to make by force-inducing air and fuel to it.
But maybe the most important part of Gale Banks' boost equation is what happens when you compress all that air.
Unfortunately, when you compress the air with any form of supercharger, you heat the air. So you really, if you put a lot of pressure in, you have to cool that air. Even there without a supercharger or turbo, you want cold air.
Wow, it looks like we're right back where we started, looking for cold air. But we're actually way ahead of the game now. Come back for a shot of very cool air under pressure when the American Muscle Car returns.